and managed to find a way to get these very large precast panel systems where we actually put the facade and the entire system together and put up, after we built the frame, we put up the skin in no time at all. So we managed the cost, the little cost increase that it cost for building the facade, we gained by reducing the time on putting the assembly of the building up. So on the ground plane, you get these massive bands of glass, and where you have public program, and then houses have this, what I'm calling a sort of me off, like Adjaya's facade, of just playful windows, which are almost, I wanted to almost make it seem as though they'd just been put in by the residents, that they were just not in any way authored by an architect trying to organize everything. And it was really just a kind of way to react against the blocks which are in the neighborhood, which are absolutely perfectly regimented and perfectly gridded. So it was a kind of, how do we sort of make this messy facade was sort of very interesting to me. And then on the sort of gable end walls, you just have, bathroom and kitchen windows, but that became the front facade of the building. So the side of the building is really the front of the building, and the front of the building is not, it's just a presentation, so the building rotates. In looking at the sort of masonry thing, we wanted to look at the history of sort of the rich history of masonry in the city, and to not be in any way scared of ornament, but be engaged with ornament, something that I've been very interested in for a very long time. And then in the research, we realized that there were these incredible urban farms in East Harlem, and that there's a Harlem Rose. There are all these incredible, I don't know if you know, there's so many names for roses, so many different species, and there's a Harlem Rose. So we became fascinated with that as a device. And I said, well, Aretha Franklin, we're gonna make roses and concrete, and but we're not gonna indent a flower. We're just going to use a kind of the reverse indentation system of just using a form liner that indents in different densities, and in the way in which the light hits it creates the pattern. So it's not really a rose pattern, it's just an indentation system, but can make you think that you're looking at flowers. That's the building in its context, and sort of surrounded here, sort of at this very interesting split of 155th and St. Nicholas Ave. That's the building in its context. So it's this jumble, but under this order of these sort of bays, and this bay system I actually directly picked up from a building round the corner, and I wanted to, almost in that sort of Venturi way, I wanted to just take a reference that was very close and very much in everybody's sort of visual space, but not seen as a kind of something that they could reference and use it. And it's basically this. And I kind of went up and down the street, and it's a kind of beautiful way in which it kind of shifts the system and creates these diagonals, and I just applied it as a system to my building. So you get this sort of game between these two buildings, and then you get the idea of this massive weight, and then this lying on this absolute transparent end. And so this is the children playing, but you can do this because the slope works so that nobody can look in, they can look down on you, and you can't see them. These are offices, and then these are the classrooms. And then the residences up above. And then the different ways in which you see the light with the detail. And this, and then sort of close up of that system. And then the sort of courtyard that we fought to get, which is the sort of entrance for the building, and then the way in which that becomes, it's really wonderful. There's now a weekly market here. So the building has now become a sort of, this is a homeless housing scheme, but now has become a community center and a place where a lot of people are coming to, and it's not a stigma, it's not a... This is looking from the children's crash into one of the courtyards. We designed all the furniture, sort of potty training stations and everything else. we went to Italy to Reggio Emiliano to learn how they made creches and brought that back, and these kind of protected courtyards that the kids could be in, and screens and different layers of courtyards. So the 3 courtyards are lined up, and you have different groups playing in them, and it can be opened as one big space. And then the museum. As you go down the museum, you get the section. Christ. You get the section of that moment where, as you go down the stair, you see this what I call a light chimney, which just brings light deep into the basement. And then this is a storytelling museum that we designed, where an artist basically comes in and creates murals that last 6 months, and narratives are spoken about those, and workshops are done about that in the teaching labs. And then it doesn't want to move. I've pressed it 6 times. There it is. Now I knew that was going to happen. Okay, so behind those are teaching spaces, where that sort of light chimney is, which becomes a kind of street away from the main gallery space, with sort of teaching spaces that are, so you're 30 feet down, but then you're flooded with light from the light chimney. So there's this sense of using the section to activate the potential of the space, and then stage in that space for events. And then off that is an annex where this is the entrance to the museum, and you basically come past a collection space where the Studio Museum lend this institution works from their collection. I mean, most museums have about 5%, oh God, 5% of their work. I didn't do that, you're doing that. Most museums lend 5%, have 5% of their collections on show. So, by giving a small fragment of this out, they were able to show more of their collections in the community. And I love this idea that more of the work can be in the world. So these kids get an amazing curation that's there. It's once a year, so it's not a big thing for the museum. And they have a collection that rotates every year of very beautiful and important works from their local collection. And then the residential corridor, which is this narrow bar up the elevators into the corridors, and then into the units. And the whole point of the bay system is that you always get this corner window that gives you an East River view or an uptown view, and then you get your windows into the space, and you get this fantastic view because of the elevation incline of the city. The south view is extraordinary. And you have everything from the sort of young professional who just sort of bought all the IKEA furniture and moved in, to their sort of white minimalist flat, and the guy we love, who just hacked the entire thing. This is a musician who, had been homeless for a while and had lots of pieces, and then got everything into this house and got lots of donated pieces from family members, etc. And it's just so much stuff. But somehow it's everything. It's this recording studio. It's everything he's always wanted. And he sent us this photo, and I really love the way it's sort of, the space is there to be used in whichever way. And then this is the community sort of hall space with the washing machines and the kind of rooms that for hire, for birthdays, bar mitzvahs, whatever. And that has this fantastic privileged balcony. And then just an overview from the back where you see how the section works with the light chimney and the courtyards and the building in its context. And then the building in the street on 155th. And from that, I wanted to show you a sort of super luxury building that I'm now building. Just to give you, I don't want you to think that it's just all about one thing. So I took on, two and a half years ago, my first sort of luxury project. And it was because really the site I thought was kind of amazing. It's in the sort of lowest part. So if we worked at the top end of New York now, we're working at the very bottom end, sort of in the old walled part, what was the old walled part of the city, on 130 William Street, which is one of the old cities. So that was sort of where 100 William Street was. which was the old boundary of the city. And it's hard to believe that, 150 years, 200 years ago, no, 150 years ago, this was New York. And then it was just like, it was a walled city. And then it sort of grew, it exploded. And, castle, the whole thing. Boats docking. Fascinating. So anyway, New York now, of course. And then our site, which is on 130 William Street. This is now William Street, which is one of the kind of big canyons down in the city, where you barely get any light down, and it's sort of the medieval plan, so you have so much compression. And we have this L-fold, and with the zoning, I said it's better to make, I wanted to see if we could make, in this area, a public space, rather than just kind of building up to the street lot, push the building back, and to go more vertical with it, and to see if we could get the core and floor ratio to work. I didn't want a skinny tower, but we wanted a tower that would make sense to allow us to kind of make this public yard. And then I said I absolutely sort of pestered the client that I really didn't want to make a glass building, because that was just the sort of thing. And I said, why don't we try and look at this quality? Don't we all love living in these kinds of buildings which are converted? Why don't we just make a tower that's about this? Remembering kind of amazing things in Italy that we know, etc. And the masonry architecture of the city. But obviously to make it anew, and then this idea of the pocket parks that are very much in the midpoint, midtown, to see if we could bring that downtown. So the project became about just making this negative, and then making this extrusion, which is this L-folded tower, and just creating a sort of open room, which is a sort of facade of a facade almost looking as though it's a sort of yard, an activated facade, but these are blind walls. That's kind of a work by an artist that's going to be in this thing, and then the double tower behind it, and this sort of folding L and the form. Oh, it's a little bit not quite, but it doesn't matter. But there's the public park. This is the public areas, and then sort of the ground planes. This is really bad, but the pictures will show. And then the plan is very simple. There's a core and a center, and different sets of facade systems that are on the outside. It's a bit of a shame you can't see the elevations, but there's the idea of the arches, and then they invert on the north and on one south elevation. This is the model of the tower. So you see how the kind of this, by shifting away from the footprint and releasing it from the party walls, you get this very slender tower, but then it starts to become this form which, as it gets to certain points, shifts again and then creates these upside down arches that create these loggias to the landscape, and then has a public sort of roof on the top. In the end, sort of working with our client, we actually, he decided not to put this at the top of the market, so it's actually has become probably one of the fastest selling sort of towers in the city right now, because it's actually priced down so that most of the tower is a sort of middle class, affordable sort of base, and then you have the sort of expensive part of the tower sort of compensating the way in which the pricing system works, which I was very happy about. And then we sort of decided that we were going to do sort of almost everything in this building. So everything from the wallpaper to the taps are designed by me. It's kind of a bit obsessive. But it felt like that's what we wanted to do. I wanted to do that then. So everything is practically sort of been manufactured. And I wanted to just see if we could make something very bespoke without, it's not right at the high end of a budget for a tower, but like one that felt like it was as though you'd spent so much money on it. I made the facade. I decided to go back to the same people that I did the facade for the Sugar Hill project to now do the facade for this tower, in a way bookending the two buildings. And we developed I said I was very interested in lava stones, so we developed a form liner that made a reverse sort of cast where you had this very almost looked like an alluvial stone, a sort of lava stone with this sort of fine sort of edge, which then frames the window system. So you get this double texture, sort of deep texture and then matte texture. So this idea of these two systems kind of colliding, and that's really the detail of the project. And so this is this is what the tower looked like in its context, with this sort of plaza, sort of the deep canyon and a sort of relief. And then when you're sort of right next to it, and then sort of the way in which I wanted basically the entrance to not even have any canopies or anything, but just to be an indent, so that this really is a public space that people can use. And then if you're a resident, you know where you go, and then you sort of go into the unit. These are sort of, sorry, showroom drawings, but I just show it. We put a basketball court in here because it's important. We insisted on, this was our insistence. We designed all the children's play spaces. And then we designed a pool that is floating at sort of, 15 stories up in the air overlooking the city, which is this kind of vaulted system with a series of plunge pools and sort of steam pools to kind of really make the idea of the tower a sort of retreat and a respite. So it's not just a kind of porous modernist building that's open to the city, it's actually slightly closed and has this kind of own internal world. And then just, this is just with interior designers doing their thing, but just excavating double height spaces, single height spaces, balconies that create not just, this is like on the 50th floor, you can have this kind of space where you have a sort of a real space outside that you can live and actually see the city if you really want to be in it. I have vertigo, so I'm terrified of balconies. And my clients are like, we can put balconies. I was like, no, we have to have negative logiers and take care of it. I'm always terrified of going to my friends' homes that have balconies. I just never go outside when there are parties. But this feels right. But so the building really is right on that sort of East River, and it sees the 4 bridges going around, so it has this incredible location. And then you see how it sort of turns and creates this upper corona. And then we wanted to celebrate the plant room in that sort of New York tradition of just turning it into a lantern, a sort of 4-story lantern. And then this is the public, for the residents, a sort of massive roof terrace that allows all the residents to be able to come up and use this facility. And it's not just for it's not for the penthouse. The penthouse has a sort of its own little space, but all that is for them. And then that's hopefully the tower in its context next to the Master's Tower. And then last, I'm going to show you the Smithsonian. So the Smithsonian really is, this project is really the last building that can be built on the mall. You know the narrative. Hopefully the story really about finally getting an institution for the African American community to represent the narrative of this community and their contribution to the building of America, and to understand the making of America through the lens of the African American experience. And that, there are 200 of these museums around the country that have been striving to say this is an important thing. All of them privately held. A couple, Detroit, Texas, and I think Chicago, have public support, but most of them are really hugely underfunded and very weak institutions, mostly relying on just simulacrum and copy to create the experience. And in a way, this is a museum about the 21st century in the sense that it is a narrative museum. It's not an artifact museum. It's not an encyclopedic museum. It is really about turning the museum idea into a way to take a journey through a narrative of 200 years. And most of the information is not artifacts. There are artifacts, and where there are them, this museum, the Smithsonian, collected the original artifacts. And then there's a lot of imagery, there's a lot of documentation, there's a lot of sort of support things that whose provenance is through their relationship to history rather than their sort of real artifact quality. And for me, some of the beautiful things about the connections, you know, when I was doing the project, people were saying, how does a British African boy win a competition to build an African American museum? And you know, I always love this image of, you know, Kwame Nkrumah, who went to school in California, FYI, knew Martin Luther King, knew Adam Clayton, knew Malcolm X, and they all were a kind of a network. They were a network, and there are many photos of their relationship and their connections, and that this idea of a kind of difference between the communities is a very modern one, that African Americans think that there's that there's a disconnect between the sort of the new generation of Africans and African Americans. Was very sad to me at that time when I was hearing those kind of criticisms, because in a way it's one network, it always has been. And some of the artifacts, which are really this idea of them having power through their relationship to history. Rosa Parks' dress, for instance, is in the museum. Harriet Tubman's Bible, the first voting slip. And to kind of prove that, sorry, this is really distracted, but to prove that kind of relationship, I always love this map. It's a Du Bois map, really showing the migration, the sort of 500 years of extraction and the relationship to America. So it's really West and Central Africa, and the reason this is so clearly documented is that it was cargo, so names were not known, tribes were not known, but numbers were carefully audited in books, and the Mormons have the best records. So that's another story. For me, the kind of unspoken story is the relationship of Africa to South America, where 9 million slaves really activated the sort of urban coast of the country and then moved inland right through to Colombia, etc. And then the Caribbean, 3 million, and then actually North America only got 500,000 slaves. And out of those 500,000 slaves, there are now nearly 39 million African Americans. So the kind of how to make a museum to kind of speak to this story, what I thought, looking at this map, I wanted to start back here. And I wanted to start imagining, it's a fiction but based on sort of fragments of facts. And it was really about this idea of what would somebody from the 14th or 15th century know about their community and culture. The Yoruba in West Africa were probably the most prolific kingdom, empire kingdom that encountered the colonial world, the colonizers, and then were broken. But at that point, the Yoruba had moved from literal figuration to abstraction, and we're negotiating abstraction as a way to deal with the massive kingdoms that they were amassing and creating. And this abstraction was happening in their shrines, and it's really funny, when this encounter happened, people thought that this was primitive work. It was actually, this comes later, after 500 years before that, of figuration mastery. If you look at the bronze work of the Benin, this is like 11th, 10th century. This comes sort of 17th, 18th, 19th century, and it's not because of lack of skill. It's a way to codify in an oral culture massive amounts of information into the figure. So the figure and the motifs all mean things. And master craftsmen have this sort of information sort of handed down to them. Olu of Ize, who carved this particular caryatid that I became really fascinated with, spoke about this motif and how it was handed down to him, and how he expanded it when it was handed down to him. It was like a single double, and he made it a triple, and the shrines that were created. And this is in the Holy of Holies, in the sort of inner sanctum shrine. And if you were sort of once a year or once a special season, the community were brought into the shrine to see the special carvings and the narratives. So it was a kind of magical thing for 15th century West Africans would have known this. And I sort of felt that that was kind of an amazing thing, that maybe somehow this form would be something to kind of play with and to bring back as a kind of device for an idea of a silhouette, which became very important in the thinking, and I'll explain that. I also became fascinated by the architecture of the South, only because of its relationship to black labor, and this idea of black labor building the South, not just the architecture, but the infrastructure, the canals, the roads. We always think of slavery as just, cotton picking, but actually it was the entire infrastructure. They were the labor force. And in a way, I wanted to see if, for me, this architecture sort of represents the ability of Southern sort of slave workers to be able to use, this technology in the North was being made in factories and cast. In the South, when you didn't have money, slaves were just taught how to make this by hand. So they would make hand cast sort of iron work to look like the factory-made Northern stuff that the Southerners didn't have. And so that became really fascinating as a way to kind of play with these two systems and to create a hybridity that would create the form. The building sits, so if this is the mall and this is the Washington Memorial Grounds here, and obviously this is the White House, it's Congress, National Archive, it sits at this apex next to the Washington Monument, and this idea that it finishes this run of cultural palaces, but then it's at the edge of the memorial grounds, was fascinating to me as a kind of, sort of in the sense that it became a panoptic system. So in the competition, I proposed a vertical museum, which any museum sort of specialist will tell you you mustn't do because nobody goes up. They always stay down. So, you get shut down when you propose that in competitions generally. But we said that actually what this tower does is to allow you to get these vistas and to bring 9 windows into the project, 9 framing windows, which allows the history of the site to also be part of the narrative of the story. And so the building is a sort of the first gold leads building on the mall, and sort of in terms of its performance, and it works by being the opposite to the palace, the sort of Neo-Greek palaces on either side, abstracted, even the SOM structure. But this idea that it's the reverse, it's almost like a shrine object where there is no center, you have to go around it, and it becomes a kind of a device that you go down into it and you go round it, and then as you go round, you get the vistas and the views, and you enter the volumes as you pass through it. It's also a cube. It's a 210-foot cube, and a cube in section as well. And it weaves the landscape, which is a Beaux-Arts landscape, which is redone by Laurie Olens amazingly, to kind of expand the sort of Beaux-Arts idea. And we just wove in it, Catherine Gustafson's team with us kind of wove it together to just become, using the design lines of people crossing the site, were just mapped and just accentuated so that one went through the building, one went round the building, and then we create a southern plaza garden and a northern garden. The 5-acre site is excavated. The entire site is a sort of giant bathtub. This was a canal here, so this is a permanent pumped site because in DC you can't go above the building height line. The landscape can make your buildings higher or lower, but you only have a sort of certain dimension that you have to always that you can maximum build to, except for if you're a national, a different kind of category of monument. History is below, and then the support system is behind it, and then there are 4 cores that support this building that rise up, and then with Guy Nordsten we just developed a column-free structure where only the 4 cores do all the work, and then the entire building is hung from that. And then the north is you have the southern entrance, but actually the north is the real entry. So this idea of this reverse is always going on in the work. So you come into this hall, and then you go down, and then you rise up from going down. And then you have different large plates which are articulated in different ways, right up to the roof. And then the section where you see it goes down 75 feet, and then you have the 210-foot cube and its relationship to Washington's monument. That's the history galleries here, and then that's the other galleries here. And you come in through the center, drop down, then drop down again, then rise up, rest here, which is a moment to reflect, and I'll explain that. And then you rise up, and then you go up, and then you're in this level. So the diagram is, for most museum, the kind of people who set up those briefs, crazy. It's like, you're not supposed to do this, but it's actually the most natural way to do it with this narrative. The skin of the building sits outside. So then what it does also is that by bringing the circulation outside, I'm able to then make this a sacrificial wall. So the content of the museum is sort of secure. This can take a rocket attack at it. So there's a whole lot of security also that is part of the way in which this building is made. That is about its sort of operation. And then the skin is really derived from a piece of ironwork that we found. Philip Simmons, an amazing ironsmith, ironwork that we got, and really just mapped it as a drawing and then densified it and tessellated it into 4 directions. So it created this new form, literally grafted out of his form. And then the building is really these different panels. There are 9 different panels. The most transparent is red, the most opaque is the purple, and that is the mapping of the facades with the 9 windows sort of being framed. And then to sort of like extensive drawings to explain this, we had to do these massive Beaux-Arts-like drawings to explain to the board how this thing was going to register and read, because everybody was terrified that nobody could look out of it, and we kept saying, you absolutely can. But it's so hard to explain. It seems so obvious now, but it was a really sort of hard thing to explain at that time. And then this is the building. I love this image of it in the snow. Sort of this moment here. Oh God, these are, your projector is not very good. There's the building in its context here. So from the Federal Triangle, this is, I love its relationship to Lincoln. So 2 cubes, sort of there, and then Washington. And then from the White House, from the sort of Lincoln balcony, it's right there. And you can't even see it, but it's there. And then sort of building. And then, you realize from the street, from 15th, you realize in Madison Drive, just at the corner, you realize that this is a solar building. It's really a 4-sided villa, sort of object, shrine, villa structure that is all about modulating the light. This is the southern exposure, which then has the canopy, which is a sort of a play at the idea of a veranda porch that you come under. It's a 65-foot cantilever on 2 columns, another sort of amazing Guy engineering masterpiece. We're sort of excited by this, and I wanted to kind of have these engineering kind of sort of heroic moments to play with Gordon Bunshaft's incredible work at the Hirshhorn and Ian Pei's work at the East Wing with this incredible facade engineering. And then, this is a real picture. It's not, but it looks a bit funny in your projector. But the whole idea of the facade is it's not laser cut. It's a sand cast. So it's exactly the same process that was done, 200-300 years ago, but obviously in a modern way. And it's nearly a 4-inch thick skin. So that thickness was really important, and I had to really fight for that so that you get this density. That it was really important. It's not just it's not a drawn cutout, which I absolutely loathe. And then the idea of the cantilever, what it does with the water pool is that we were able to create a microclimate at the entrance. So in summer, we reduced the temperature by as much as 8 degrees. So you really visibly feel a cool current here, and then the stack effects are released at the back so that you get this release of air at the back, which sort of disengaged facade. So this becomes the coolest space on the mall, and people just come and just sit there before either going out or going into the museum. And then when you come to the museum, you see the building within the building. You realize that as you enter, it's a glass building with this solid system, and then you have these 4 lights, these 4 views on the ground floor. And then you go to the north, and then you descend down. And you go down 40 feet, and then you collect an elevator that takes you down very slowly another 40 feet. This is a sort of room-size elevator, and then you get into the bowels of the building, and then you start the story. And you start sort of with the encounter in Africa, and then you get to the main sort of moment where the museum sort of unfolds, which is at the sort of Declaration of Independence, and you start with Jefferson and his slaves and the amount of slaves he had. That's the stock index boxes of all his slaves. That's kind of crazy then when you get into the information. The exhibits are really amazing. They're, everything that you see that is an artifact is real. It's not a simulacrum. That is a real train, a Pullman train that we had to bring into the building and seal. This was an incredible effort. We had to engineer this so that this train is on this kind of cantilevered balcony. But this is one of the segregation trains, sort of plantation structure that was dismantled and brought back. Fragments of the true cross of the slave ships were sort of gotten in near South Africa, near Cuba, which are also in the building. And as you go around, there's this kind of bronze glowing box that you will sort of get to. And as you sort of rise through the building and rise through the narrative of the history galleries, you always are able to look back and see technologies used extensively. Emmett Till's coffin is just here, which is a sort of very powerful space to go into. We don't take pictures of it because the family don't want pictures of it to be in the public realm. And then you sort of end by coming to the place where you started, and then you go up this space, which is this Zimbabwe stone-clad space, into a bronze laminated glazed box with it's a 30-foot scale, it's 30-foot high space with a waterfall, which announces the entrance as an oculus that brings in light, but it's based on Martin Luther King's words. And we just wanted an element, and of course the middle passage and water is the kind of main element of the community through suffering, and also, you know, in the sort of spiritual world, this idea of justice and uplift through water. And that on the north, when you come in, is this seating element that you see water rushing from, but you can't see where it goes because the angle that we set, is so deep that you can't actually get a sight line through. And that was a deliberate thing. We set this thing so that really you could only see the water falling, and then when you came into the space, you would see, you would finish the idea. And then auditorium, rise up into the light, the way in which the glass also stacks with the ziggurat, and then you rise. And then these are the lenses that are to the 9 windows. Sometimes they're very large vitrines that come to the windows, and then the screen, and how the screen envelops you in the west, because you're always moving along the west, northwest, so that you're always against the sunlight, the dramatic light from midday. And then exhibition spaces, and then framing views. This is Jefferson's Dome, sort of from here. When there's something that is representing a character, and then it's always in silver, so that it's never trying to be a realistic representation. It's always a sort of just a sort of cast, almost, as it were. And it's really a deliberate thing to counter this idea of trying to make these sort of Madame Tussauds, what we call in Britain Madame Tussauds structures inside the narrative of the museum. So the history is below. This mid-level is about the migration to cities, the professionalizing of the community. And you know, this big window, this is one of the 9 windows, we sort of devised this very tortuous room with this very crazy angle, and this moment where you could frame the entire Washington Monument's shaft in this one window. And then you have sort of in that celebrated all the black soldiers and generals since the Declaration of Independence, sort of with the first general of America, as it were. And as you come right up, so you get the framing, and we had to use computers to make this work and to prove that it worked. Because it's a very strange cut in the building, and it's the only diagonal cut on the building, and everybody wondered, is it some kind of gesture, or is it like a Daniel Libeskind quote, was what I was told. I'm mortified. I was like, this is about making you see this straight, because there's no other way to do it. So it's one moment where the gesture rotates, and then you sort of rise up. And then at the end, you get the contribution of the community to culture. So from the migration to the cities, then the migration into world culture. What's really amazing is that this sculpture has been stuck in the basement in Frankfurt, never seen until I did this project and found this thing, and now it's become the star attraction at the top floor of this museum. It's on a large lawn there, This is sort of a 19th century, the 19th century carving, and then the different spaces, the window to Congress here, contemporary art, the Juliet balcony that frames the White House here, sort of through there. And then a sort of large panorama window which looks over the Washington Memorial Grounds, which is the sort of best panorama sort of window of the grounds. And then up above, the library space and genealogy space, sort of at dusk, and the way in which the light and the building operate. And its relationship to its context. And the building really changes color and light all the way through, and then from the memorial grounds, looking back at it, no building in DC is allowed to be lit, self-lit, but we manage this because this building's circulation's on the perimeter, so all its safety lights I brought to the perimeter. So when you see it glowing, it's not because it has special lights, it's because that's the safety lights that are required, which then gives me a lantern, which was a thing that they couldn't stop. So we have the only glowing cultural building on the mall. Thank you. Yes.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
He will take questions.
How many units are available in that tower? The middle class.
There, I think it's 255 units, something like that. Yeah. Thank you.
No question. Come on, this is usually a feisty lot. Will Bruder.
Oh, Will, hi.
So,
Yeah.
I'd like to see all the hand drawings that you do. It seems like you're involved intimately from the beginning.
Yep.
How does your whole team work?
Yep.
Based on-
Yep. So, yep. No, I'm the design director of my office, so everything has my fingerprints all over it. I sketch a lot. I sort of believe in that sort of way in which there's some transmission that happens between the mind and the hand. But I work with directors. I have about 7 directors now that I work with in the 3 different offices. And they really, almost all of them have been with me. I think the youngest has been with me for 10 years. The rest have been with me for nearly 20 years. And they help me produce the buildings. So they really allow me to come and do things like this whilst they're doing doing the meetings. and they allow me to think. So in a way, I always say my office is a little bit like a football team. I'm the quarterback. So I get the ball and they run forward. And my job is to think and to think through the issues, and they are in the field, making sure it gets done, and I can jump in and out. It's just a way to make space, because architecture just needs time and needs reflection, as you know. So this is a strategy for how to make space.
So you provide extensive research.
Yes.
Which is very impressive. So are you involved in leading the research effort, or do you?
So that's a good question. It started off as something that I just did with the architects, and we just, it was a thing. But now, actually, my wife runs that section of my office, and we have social scientists and gender specialists and poverty, and these incredible people. There's a whole myriad of people that has now joined our office that are from the LSC or from NYU, and we have there's about 4 or 5 in each space, each office, and they're just continually mining information. And it's now become a process that every project that's brought in then has this work that's actually done by the research team first. And then I work with them at the beginning and sketch after. So I used to do the work and then do my own meditation. Now they do it and present the information they're getting to me. I crit their information. They dive more till we get to where we need to, and then that informs how I make my work. So, and then it becomes architecture.
The narrative experience at the African American Museum where you go down to kind of hold the ship and work your way up is really powerful to experience in person. I'm wondering if you could talk about how that emerged. Was it in the design competition, or is it working with a team of curators? How you kind of arrived at that whole sequence?
It was from day one, and it was a move to. We just said that we wanted the experience of the entire building from the very idea of the visible, how you saw it in the city, to be different to how you experience normal museums. In a way, a normal museum is a kind of palace form, which is a sort of a structure that's working within the kind of topology of the city, and then, it's a set of rooms that you develop. What we didn't want was to develop. I didn't want a set of rooms. I didn't want it to be a place with things in it, because essentially the whole museum is not about things. It's about a journey. So I said that for me it was important that if we were going to make a journey, that we literally created a simulation with the user that brought you down into something that was experiential. Basically darkness, and then to bring you into light. So if the curatorial agenda, right from the competition entry, was split into 3. And I used that 3 to sort of turn this thing around. And in the original competition entry, I actually had a podium. When you came out into the light, there was a kind of large podium, a sort of stone podium. And by the end of it, the podium actually became a landscape. It sort of fell down. But the form above started off as one plate with 2 corona, and then in the end it became 3 and a garden. But it's the same diagram. Yes.
Was it an invited competition or no?
It was an open call, and then there were, it sort of went to 20, and then it went down to 6. And then the 6 were paid to.
Well, when you say 20, was there a short list of 20?
I heard, this is because I now know the backstory, but basically I think when the open call went out, I think it was about 90 architects from around the world applied, and they culled that down to 20, and then a jury kind of came around that 20 and culled it down to 6.
Had they submitted designs or?
No, it was just quals, just your profile, who you are, what you could do. And,
Remember who you competed against?
I want to know why you're on the list.
it's all on the internet. But it's, Norman Foster, Ian Pei's office, the usual suspects. I was called the giant killer for doing that one.
I have a question for you to get to more formal things. Over the years, your work has evolved from an emphasis on mass and an absence of articulation to a use of grids in the idea building and all that, to something much more filigree and much lighter. Any self-reflection on how that happens?
I think that you can see in my character and what I'm doing that I'm always interested in going to where people think I shouldn't be. But I think that I'm also, if you look at it more carefully, that it's about an image of public work. And I started to realize that I was very interested in a different way of working. I didn't want to use architecture as a kind of language which then sort of started off in residential and then enlarged up to public buildings, because I just felt that there was a kind of fiction in that. So in my mind, the mass volumetric buildings were really about these small retreat-like forms, and they were about countering the idea of the, in a way for me, modernism and the kind of the city beautiful was really about making the image of the city. So the porosity of even the residential and the public was all about kind of creating a certain image of a sort of permeable, light-filled city. And I think, in the 21st century, the way in which, for me, residences operate with the hyperdensity we have is that it becomes a refuge from the city. It's actually it's actually almost a device against the city. So my early projects were really against the city, even though, I'm not against, I love the city, but it was a kind of romantic against, So I was always seeing my work as kind of shutting the city down and creating a relationship to nature. That's what the residential projects are.
But the objects remain very much objects.
Exactly.
You just have to work harder and harder to get them to be objects.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then in the public buildings, they're objects, but they're dissolved.
Right.
they dissolve. So they don't dissolve through the articulation of windows, they dissolve through the dematerialization of the mass. Yeah.
Which still remains mass.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, describe your house. Describe where you live.
You know, I think I've described that. I'm very interested in, you know, private spaces being very much retreats. So it's a very introverted space. It's dark. I love residential spaces that are not bathed in light, but look at light. So I'm very interested. I think my generation or my sort of thinking is that I think that this idea of a kind of light-filled space is I think it's exhausted for me, and I'm interested in the mystery of light. So I think, and to have that sort of mystery with light and that sort of relationship to it, and to have a bit more awe in nature, I think you have to be able to look at it rather than just take it for granted. So I'm interested in spaces that sort of break down light and allow you to kind of see its phenomena. Yeah, because I think it has a kind of powerful emotional impact.
So you built your own house.
That's a complicated question. I have an apartment. I have a couple of apartments and I have a house, yes.
One more question.
What was your
Ryan.
biggest misconception about architecture as a student?
Be careful, he'll turn it into a meme.
My biggest misconception. I think that the moment, I mean, and it's usually just, you know, with great teachers, I for a very long time really couldn't understand it, and I didn't see what it was about. I thought it was a bit off, and then I suddenly realized that it was actually, like any art form, it was a powerful tool to make a statement about how you saw society. And I think when I suddenly realized that, it became very fascinating, and that's when the passion started.
Fantastic. Thank you again.